From Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, I'm David Weston. Welcome now to Balance of Power, where the world of politics meets the world of business. President Trump traveled to Kenosha, Wisconsin yesterday and kept to his law and order theme, talking about all the residents who weren't demonstrating but wanted peace restored.
You could take the people of Kenosha that aren't here and that you won't see and that aren't protesting, but they want change also. They want to see law and order. They want great police force. They want people that are going to keep them safe, where their houses aren't broken into, where they're not raped and murdered. That's what they want.
We welcome now Bloomberg political contributor Rick Davis of Stone Court Capital. So, Rick, it's pretty clear that this is a major theme for President Trump as he seeks re-election. It sounds a little like immigration did in the past.
That's right, David. He really struck this tone during the Republican convention just last week and continues on into the fall campaign, which has started now. And that is sort of divide and conquer. He looks at the political equation as those who will support a very clear black and white option. The black and white option 4 years ago was the border and immigration, using almost the same rhetoric that illegal immigrants were drug dealers, rapists, and murderers. And now that has transitioned into his description of social unrest around the country.
Does that put Joe Biden, his rival, in a difficult situation? Because he's trying to take a tack that is not black and white. It's basically saying we should allow demonstrations. That's okay, but we shouldn't be violent. We heard him on Monday. How effective was that speech he gave on Monday?
Yeah, I think it was an effective speech setting out some barriers and some boundaries for this debate around Donald Trump. Look, it's always easier from a political context to make a negative stick in voters' minds, right? They remember the negative, and Trump is particularly good at embedding these sort of dark themes into voters' minds. Biden has an additional requirement where he has to convince voters that he's the right guy to solve the problem, not just describe it. And his solutions are much less dramatic. It's not pulling out the military or the police and breaking heads. It's finding common cause amongst people to solve problems within the community. Very difficult to convey that in a way that voters will get excited, but really the only option he has to transition with Trump.
At the same time, there's a lot of talk about suburban voters, particularly female voters. I must say not just white, but suburban female voters across the board. Is there a risk on the president's part that they will recoil from him being too harsh?
Sure, and they did in 2018 in the midterms, those same suburban voters. And you're right, suburbs are much more integrated than they used to be. And so when you're talking about white voters, white women voters, that's only a segment of the women vote in the suburbs. And so, sure, I think Biden has their ear right now. They've already said they have problems with the Trump administration on unrelated issues, but they also care about security of their neighborhoods. And so some of these darker themes espoused by Trump will have some resonance. But right now, I would say Biden has a receptive audience, and it's his to lose at this stage in the suburbs.
Talk to me about the overall strategy of the Biden camp versus the Trump camp, because it's pretty clear right now Trump wants to be out and about, so to speak. Biden, not quite so much. We see the president actually going to North Carolina today. Again, he's going to be out. Is Joe Biden almost having a rose garden strategy, even though he's not in the White House?
If you can grow roses in a basement, that would be his strategy. Certainly, Biden's strategy related to COVID was to be more respectful of the social distancing, travel, and mask guidance that he'd been getting from experts. Donald Trump's the opposite. He wants to reopen right away. He wants to avoid the appearance of wearing a mask. And he thrives off of crowds, regardless of whether they're socially distant. Right now, I would say advantage Trump because he's out campaigning actively, and the media likes to cover that. Much more difficult to cover daily, electronic news briefs from the Biden camp. And so I think you see Biden's announced that he'll be going to Wisconsin this week and getting out of the basement and starting to wage a more active campaign.
So what would you be advising the Biden camp right now if they asked you?
Well, I think that the strategy that he's got to start getting out and being more aggressive and pushing back on Trump, both from a messaging point of view, but also physically, getting around to these target states is crucial. He hasn't been in Wisconsin in 2 years. They were supposed to have a convention there. It shows you how important the state was. And now I think he's got to take it on the road and carry this message that it's not his watch that they've got to worry about as far as violence in the streets. It's Donald Trump's. That's why it's happening now.
Well, and we're watching the polls narrow, apparently. There are a number of polls coming out now that seem to be showing a narrowing, and even President Trump going ahead in some key places. At the same time, the former Vice President Biden is winning one thing, it appears right now, and that is fundraising. $300 million in 1 month, Rick?
Yeah, in excess of $300 million, almost double what he raised a month ago. And so obviously the convention and his fundraising apparatus have really hit their mark. But also you can tell that there's some intensity behind the Biden camp through these kinds of things like, really big fundraising months. The campaign was bound to close. The country's pretty well divided. With only a few percentage points of undecided voters at this stage. So, you knew that would sort of show up. Still very much Biden's to lose in the sense that in the vast majority of the battleground states, Biden's still ahead. But in some cases, by much smaller margins than Hillary Clinton was 4 years ago. So there is an anticipation that this could be a pretty close election.
Rick, one last thing here. Mr. Biden is speaking out today on education, returning to schools. Does he need to give this campaign back into the question of returning to schools? Because that gets us back to coronavirus pretty quickly.
Yeah, the education issue is an important issue related to coronavirus, but also it targets those suburban women that we were talking about earlier. This is a very, very important issue for them on whether or not they can get their kids back to school, what will be the future of education in the next administration, and more conversation about the responsible approach to COVID to contrast with the Trump administration's efforts to try and reopen as quickly as possible, regardless of the implications of COVID.
Rick, and one quick one on the state of Massachusetts, that Senate race. It turned out to be quite a drama there between Joe Kennedy and Ed Markey.
Well, it wasn't as close as anybody thought it was going to be, but it was dramatic. It's the first time a Kennedy has ever lost on the ballot in Massachusetts. That is a big deal. And what really is instructive is that he lost by the same kind of coalition that Kennedys used to win repeatedly, sort of left-of-center young people. Senator Markey was able to play the progressive card and keep those young liberal voters on his side and undermining the attractiveness of the Kennedy brand. I'd say it's the end of Camelot.
Yeah, Kennedy losing Massachusetts sure sounds like it. Thanks so much to Bloomberg contributor Rick Davis. Great to have you with us. And some breaking news right now on billionaire investor Bill Ackman. You remember he has a SPAC, one of those blank check companies for $4 billion. Well, Bloomberg has learned that he approached Airbnb about a merger with that blank check company, but the home rental site said no thank you very much. It said it prefers a traditional initial public offering. Meanwhile, coming up here, the ups and downs of the coronavirus. We talk with Dr. Steve Corwin, CEO of New York-Presbyterian Hospital. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. We turn now to Mark Crumpton for Bloomberg First Word News.
David, thank you. Health officials are signaling there may be a new phase in the country's fight against the coronavirus. New cases are declining in some recent hotspots, but they're spiking in places like Iowa and South Dakota. Officials say events like college reopenings and the Sturgis motorcycle rally in South Dakota are likely playing a role, but officials say it's also a sign Americans may be letting their guards down after months of restrictions. Overall, U.S. cases this week topped 6 million. And David, to follow up on what you and our colleague Rick Davis were discussing a few moments ago, a new national poll shows that President Trump has cut into Joe Biden's lead in the race for the White House. The poll from USA Today and Suffolk University has Biden with a 50 to 43% lead. That's down from a 12-point advantage the Democratic nominee held in June. In Brazil, the government's been handing out so much cash in response to the pandemic that poverty is approaching an historic low. About 30% of the population, 66 million people in Brazil, have been getting $110 a month. That makes it Brazil's most ambitious social program ever. One university says the percentage of people below the poverty line has fallen to a 16-year low. But many are questioning how long President Jair Bolsonaro can keep up those payments. 75 years ago today, World War II ended when Japan surrendered aboard the USS Missouri. That ended a global nightmare that left as many as 85 million people dead. More than 16 million Americans served in uniform. As of May, the Department of Veterans Affairs said about 300,000 were still alive. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Quick Take by Bloomberg, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thank you so much, Mark. I want to come back to that story that Mark just covered about the coronavirus. As he said, even as the rates of infection flatten and drop in places like California and Texas, they are on the rise in several states across the Midwest. We welcome now Dr. Stephen Corwin. He is CEO of York-Presbyterian, one of the leading hospitals in the country and the largest in the New York City area. So thank you very much for being with us, Doctor. Give us your sense of where we are right now, because it feels almost like whack-a-mole. As we knock it down in New York, it goes to Texas. As it goes down to Texas, it goes to Illinois. What is going on with this disease?
Well, I think the moving average across the country is moving down, and that is good news. I think, as we've talked about before, David, as you start to open, you're going to titrate infections. You have to be capable of sort of dealing with those outbreaks, which is why testing becomes so important, and contact tracing, to try to keep a lid on this thing until we're capable of treating it and having a vaccine for it. So the moving average going down is positive. Some of these hotspots obviously are a problem. The opening of colleges, the opening of schools presents a challenge. Indoor dining presents a challenge. Opening theaters presents a challenge. And we have to be mindful of that so that we can scale it back if it looks like we're having an outbreak in a particular area. In New York, we're down to about 2% of our COVID peak, which is very comforting. But now we're going to look at New York City schools reopening. There's going to be a push for more indoor venues as the weather gets colder. We're going to have influenza start in the fall. So I think seeing that moving average go down and seeing the daily infections go down below the 10,000 number is what Dr. Fauci has said would be comforting if we could get to that by October.
So a lot of challenges. Are we up to meeting the challenges? How are we doing on this? Because it looks like we may have to manage this disease for a while before there's this magical cure called a vaccine. Can't count on that. Can we reopen our economy? Can we reopen our schools to some extent prudently?
I hope that we can, David. I think that we missed the boat a little, quite frankly, in terms of not tamping down the infection number. I think we had the debate over masks, social distancing. I don't think that helped us as a country. We politicized it, which was unfortunate. But I think that maintenance of masks, maintenance of social distancing, getting the infection number down will allow us to cautiously reopen the economy, as we're doing. Look, we have to reopen the economy. We can't stay still forever, but you want to do it in as prudent a manner as possible. You read in the Financial Times today, as well as other venues, that Germany thinks that they're having a V-shaped recovery. Part of that is because they were able to control the pandemic to a greater extent than we have. So I think that the two go hand in glove.
Are we making good progress on the testing front? You mentioned testing, and it seems like almost every day we have a new report, like Abbott Labs has something out that takes 15 minutes and doesn't cost very much money. Are we making substantial progress on testing?
Not as much as I would like. We still have issues with reagent shortages and things of that nature, so we can't do as much testing as we would like. But let's just talk about the point-of-care testing for a moment. Some of the point-of-care tests can do a test every 15 minutes. That's 4 tests an hour. The machines that we have made by Cepheid, Roche, and others, we can do batch testing where we can do thousands of tests a day. So if we had the reagents for it, with these machines, we can do turnaround in less than 24 hours, and we can get these things done quickly. The public ought to be mindful that point of care testing sounds great, but ultimately you want to be able to do a high volume of tests on a frequent basis. You want a low enough level of infection so that if you identify an infection, you can do contact tracing and then test the contact traces in a 3 to 5 day period to make sure they're not infected. That's the key. I thought it was unfortunate that the CDC came out with guidelines for less testing. You need more testing, and I don't think there's much dispute, at least in the scientific community and the people I've been speaking to, about that.
Well, I wonder about that. I mean, you're a doctor. You head up one of the major hospitals in the country. You can sort of sift through this. For those of us out here in the real world, how do we figure out what the truth is? Because as you say, CDC came out and said you don't need to test people who are asymptomatic. We had a flurry of people, experts, come out and say, no, that's not right at all. Are they undermining their own credibility to some extent? And then we have this convalescent plasma thing where the government says it's just fine. Now we hear NIH says, well, I'm not sure we know.
I think it was very unfortunate, and it does undermine the credibility of the FDA and the CDC. The FDA mistake was egregious. It should never have happened. You're talking about a subset of patients, and you're talking about a misrepresentation of the statistics, even according to the people who did the study. And that then so what are the consequences of that? Then that gets everyone to say, I want convalescent plasma, as opposed to let's study this more rigorously and see whether it works or not. And we got into that same conundrum with hydroxychloroquine. So I think that was very unfortunate. I think the CDC, quite frankly, that was unfortunate as well. The simple answer is we need to rigorously test various therapies to see if they work. We need to do the rigorous testing on the phase 3 of the vaccine trials to make sure that if we're going to inoculate and mass inoculate, that works. And there can't be any appearance that this is politicized, either for the president's benefit or the benefit of Mr. Biden. It's got to be that we're in this together, right, and that we're trying to improve the public health. So I don't think we're in a good place in terms of that. You've got now, this is a Democrat-Republican issue, and it should not be.
Dr. Corwin, you, of course, are a physician. You were chief of medicine before you were CEO, but you are CEO now, and you've got a really big company, a business to run. You've said before that your company may lose as much as $1 billion out of operating income because of the coronavirus this year. How are you doing financially? And in particular, there was $100 billion appropriated in the CARES Act to go to hospitals. Did you see some of that money?
We did. We'll lose in the $200 to $300 million range through June, and that's far less than we would have lost had we not received the CARES money. We've advocated that the Medicare advances for all hospitals around the country, rural and otherwise, be converted into grants. That would help as well. We still are anticipating a loss anywhere between $700 million and $1 billion towards the end of the year. We do see our volumes coming back. That's been very encouraging. The fact that, again, the volumes are coming back is completely coincident with the fact that people feel safer. That being said, I think that, we're looking for a 20 that will be rough, and we're hoping that 21 will be better, and we're looking that by 22 we'll be out of the worst of it from a perspective of a major institution. Now, we have a fair amount of cash on hand, cash reserves, and a very strong balance sheet to be able to withstand that. I do have concerns about critical access hospitals, rural hospitals, and safety net hospitals that do not have that ability. And so, as with other industries, I think you're going to be seeing a shakeout in this fall in terms of layoffs, and potentially even bankruptcies, especially if the economy is not coming back and more people are out of jobs that comes to the negative on the hospital side. So I still think the hospital industry is not by any means out of the woods.
Doctor, really great to have you with us. Appreciate your time. That's Dr. Stephen Corwin. He is New York-Presbyterian President and CEO. Still ahead, what are the markets telling us about the upcoming election? We get the latest from Abigail Doolittle. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. Every day we get new polls of registered voters, of likely voters, of voters across the nation, of voters in battleground states. But what do those with money on the line think about the election? Welcome now, Abigail Doolittle, for a read on the election market metrics.
Well, David, this is super interesting because as you were mentioning polls, so mainly the polls are favoring candidate Biden over President Trump, but they are narrowing as you have been following yourself. This is super interesting because the betting odds have narrowed dramatically. Now, back in August, Joe Biden had his odds at 61% of beating President Trump, as President Trump only had 36% odds of beating Joe Biden. Now they're both very close to 50%. So those odds have narrowed and narrowed. It'll be interesting to see whether or not we start to see polls narrow even more from where they were. Again, this is really turning into a pretty tightly contested race per the betting odds. And we've had many talking about the possibility, including myself, of volatility going into the election. If we take a look at the Vix Curve, it really makes this point. The Vix Curve, of course, is quote-unquote fear index. Right now, spot Vix right around 25. Historically, that's very high, but it's nothing compared to this high as 85 when we were in the March lows for stocks. However, for September right now, what we're looking at is closer to 28, 32 in October and 34 in November. So really rising volatility into the election. What makes this so interesting, though, David, is this looks forward by 30 days. So November at 34, that's actually December. That suggests that this election could either be contested, there can be some other issue, maybe the Senate goes to the Democrats. It's going to be a very interesting fall indeed, David.
Yeah, a lot of uncertainty out there, certainly in the political front, without any doubt. Thanks so much now to Abigail Doolittle. Up next, he's run one of the most influential media outlets in the country, and it's called the New York Times. We're going to talk with CEO Mark Thompson about the business of news and whether impartiality can survive this election. Mr. Thompson ran the BBC over in England before, so he has a comparative view about U.S. versus U.K. political coverage. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and radio. I'm David Weston. For Bloomberg First Word News, we go now to Mark Crumpton.
David, thank you. America's top infectious disease expert is worried about the upcoming Labor Day holiday. Dr. Anthony Fauci tells NBC the long weekend may lead to a rise in coronavirus cases in the United States, as was the case after Memorial Day and the 4th of July. Dr. Fauci said a surge may be avoided if people wear masks and avoid crowded places. He also said college students should stay on campus. Thailand says it has 100 days without a confirmed locally transmitted case of COVID-19. Thailand was the first country outside of China to confirm a case in January, but has not had a high number of cases. But Thailand's economy has been devastated by the absence of foreign tourists who are banned from entry and by a drop in exports. Officials in Germany say tests show unequivocally that Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny was poisoned by a nerve agent. The German government will consult with the European Union and NATO to come up with a response. Moscow denies that it was involved. Navalny was a fierce critic of Russian President Vladimir Putin and of the Kremlin. 14 people went on trial in France's terrorism court today for the 2015 attacks against the Charlie Hebdo satirical newspaper and the kosher supermarket in Paris. 17 people and all 3 gunmen died during the 3 days of attacks in January of 2015. Later that year, a separate network of French and Belgian fighters for Islamic State struck Paris again, that time killing 130 people in attacks at the Bataclan Concert Hall, the National Stadium, and in bars and restaurants. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take. powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thanks so much, Mark. Well, when Mark Thompson went from running the BBC to running the New York Times in 2012, the Times had 500,000 digital subscribers. It now is approaching 6 million on its way to the 10 million goal that Thompson hoped to reach by 2025. And it realized some $450 million in revenue for those subscribers last year. Mr. Thompson is now stepping down from his position this month, turning things over to his hand-picked successor. And we welcome him now back to Bloomberg. So, Mark, thanks so much for being here. Take us through that transition of the last 8 years, because it strikes me it's not just we added a lot of digital subscribers. There also is a fundamental shift in the business model because the New York Times has always been based largely on advertising.
Hi, David. Yeah. So what we decided to do, there were 4 revenue streams when I arrived at the company, still are today. Print advertising, which once had been more than 80% of the total revenue of the company had been print advertising, print subscription, digital advertising, and digital subscription. And really, my kind of BDI narrowed in on digital subscription as the revenue stream we should really grow, and indeed had to grow, because ultimately, for different reasons, all of the other revenue streams, it seemed to me, were in trouble potentially, and ultimately might even disappear. So we doubled down on the very simple idea of great journalism packaged effectively in good digital products, which establish a very close relationship with people who are prepared to pay to get that journalism, and that becoming really the bedrock of the entire future of the company. And to do that, we invested in our newsroom. We actually built the newsroom. We've got 250 more journalists now than when I walked into the building. And we also got smart about digital product. We hired hundreds of software engineers and data scientists, machine learning people, and graphic designers and videographers, and really worked on the digital product. And we've ended up with a kind of virtuous circle where I think the content is as rich and broad as it's ever been. It's much more effectively packaged up in products, and people are flocking to buy the products as new subscribers.
So, Mark, you describe it as simple, but it was far from conventional wisdom when you took over. I mean, most newspaper people, as you and I both know, in the United States had said, look, we made the mistake early on of making this free on the internet. There's no way we can charge with it, with the possible exception of the Financial Times, maybe the Wall Street Journal, because it's a specially business publication. So what you did may have been simple, but it was not what most people thought would work.
That's true of our industry, but if you step back, I mean, Reed Hastings was thinking the same thought about high quality TV in relation to Netflix. Daniel Ek and Co at Spotify were thinking the same about music, that there was a way of getting great entertainment or great music to the world's public, and enough people out there would pay for it to make a great business. And really, all we're really doing, I think we're part of a broader trend towards direct digital subscription relationships with people who want really good stuff, and that's an entire sector which is growing very rapidly. And in a way, it's a little bit like the moment when cable TV arrived in the US, and suddenly there was a choice of something beyond regular broadcast TV television. And I think that although it's true that the broadcast model is happening to broadcast TV right now is post-growth and is going to be very difficult to sustain even its current level, it turns out these other forms of getting TV and music and news could grow. There was once a really big market in paid news in America, and it wasn't just the New York Times. It was local newspapers, it was metros, it was magazines, and all the rest of it. People paid billions and billions of dollars as subscribers and buying these products from newsstands. There's no reason why that market can't be recaptured, it seems to me.
But how would that happen, Mark, as a practical matter? Because when you came in, the New York Times still had a very robust newsroom, directed toward print largely, but very robust newsroom. A lot of newspapers across the country, these are regional as well as local papers, really have had to cut back so far. They've let those newsrooms go. Is it possible at this point to rebuild that? Can your model apply beyond the New York Times, I guess is what I'm asking.
And the answer is, because so few people have even tried it, I don't think we know. But to me, I mean, I think there's one basic big caveat, which is this is a kind of horse and buggy to automobile moment. And that requires capital. You have to risk some money, you have to invest to make the change. But assuming someone wants to invest, I don't see at all why, if you rehire your journalists, rebuild that newsroom, start doing great reporting, and start getting smart about how you get it to the public, well, you can't really build a new business. I think the mistake made was thinking that you could kind of eke your way to the digital future without putting any fresh money in. And no one could do that. Nobody could take a kind of horse carriage factory and turn it into a car company without vast fresh investment. And this is one of those periods in media which is very capital intensive. It requires lots of money. But for people who are prepared to put the money in, I think there are great businesses to be built.
But the other thing we saw was people take a look at Facebook and Google and say they're so massive, their audience is so large, we have no choice but to go through them. We have to hitch our wagon to them, even though they will have the direct relationship with our subscriber, our customer. I mean, even New York Times flirted with that for a time. So is it possible for people to do this directly? I mean, you have a direct relation to the subscriber.
And we believe that although digital social media, Facebook and the rest of it, Google search, and all of these platforms are really important in people finding our content, hearing about the Times and making sure our journalism is really influential, that we really needed a kind of trail of breadcrumbs from these other platforms back to the mothership, back to the New York Times experience. And we need to get smart about guiding people. So even if they heard about us, found about us, read their first pieces on these platforms, more and more they'd come to us. And to your broader point, I want to say that a few years ago, recorded music went through a very similar kind of complete crisis of confidence and assumed that other people, they worried about Apple, they worried about pirates, they worried about YouTube and so on. Other people, in the end, were so powerful they couldn't rebuild their business. But about 2 or 3 years ago, I think 2017, the global recorded music industry started growing its revenue again. Hasn't got back to its peak yet, but that's now looking like a strong industry. And there's no reason why the news industry can't bottom out and start rebuilding. But it requires you to have faith in the public, to believe that people out there really want quality. And you have to, I'm afraid, it's quite tough, I think, for the industry. You have to reach for your pocketbook and actually invest.
Mark, what do you make of the efforts by some governments now to get into the game? You see what's going on in Australia, where Australia essentially is moving in the direction of requiring Facebook to pay a license fee to newspapers. And it appears that Europe may not be too far behind. Do you think that's a wise move?
Well, I want to say, I'm going to give you, I'm afraid, a slightly kind of two-handed answer. On the one hand, I do think that trying to strike a deal, I think preferably a commercial deal rather than one which is forced on everyone by regulators and by politicians, but a deal whereby the big platforms do recognize the value they get from the content we all make, and that's reflected in payments. I think that in principle is actually a good thing. Honestly, I do think there's a real value transfer, and it should be acknowledged. I worry about putting more power in the hands of regulators and politicians. This is a moment in world history where governments everywhere are rather greedy to get their hands on media, and I'm afraid straightforwardly so that they can bend it to their political advantage. That's happening not just in America, but everywhere. This sense of, it's all the media's fault. We really need to control the media. We need to help them understand what they really should be doing. And if you give them control over the purse strings as well, albeit via regulators and legislation, I worry about unintended consequences. The real trouble with regulatory intervention and new laws is inevitably they're drafted by politicians. They're inevitably out of date by the time they're signed, and the risk is unintended consequences. But I also do think that there is a political reckoning coming, and the major platforms, I think, would be well advised to work with publishers like the New York Times to try and find a better way through a voluntary commercial relationship.
Mark, we do have an election coming up this fall. You may have noticed.
I've heard that.
Exactly.
I've heard that,
And I wonder what you think about covering this election. I mean, things have gotten more and more partisan, more and more divided in this country. You come from Great Britain, and certainly the BBC really tries to be neutral, even though the government may not always agree that it's neutral. But on the other hand, you have newspapers that are decidedly partisan. Is there still room for an impartial newspaper here? Let's be honest. Some people think the New York Times already has moved left of center.
Well, in its opinion pages, and in particular in its editorials, the New York Times does host opinions and its own editorials, its leader columns, as it were, the opinion of the New York Times or at least its editorial board, does definitely lean left. In its news pages, it strives to be very objective. But, and you know this as well as I do, to someone who's got very strong political opinions, who's got a very clear ideology, impartial looks partial. Impartial looks like it's hostile because it's not agreeing with everything you believe and you say. And the truth is, when politics are very polarized, almost no one wants impartial news. What they really want is news which helps their side. My view is we just have to be patient. This is a moment in American political history, a very similar moment, some differences, but essentially much of the same trends are playing out in the UK and most other European countries that I know of. I think we have to stick to our guns. I think in the end, impartial truth, actual facts, a real perspective on what's happening is more valuable than versions of the news which favor, one side, hide stuff which is awkward or embarrassing for that side. I think that stuff in the end, it's quite entertaining. It may pat you on the back if you've got very strong political views of one sort or the other. It doesn't really help you understand the world. And in the end, I think the truth wins. So my view is batten down the hatches. It's going to be a very bumpy few months, I think. This is an election which may not be decided on election night. It may drag on for days, weeks, even months because of postal votes. And because I'm one of those people who think it's going to be an unbelievably tight election, probably by the time we get there. But I think what you have to do as a professional, independent, impartial journalist, and that's what I used to be and still am really under the skin. I think you just have to do your job, try and remain as objective as you can, strive to be as fair as you can to everyone, and report what you see.
Yeah, we're going to need that impartial journalism more than ever, I fear. Thank you so much. It's great. And Mark, congratulations on a great run, really. That's Mark Thompson. He's the outgoing New York Times CEO. Coming up here, are we going to get that fourth round of fiscal stimulus? And by the way, do we really need it? We talk with Republican Congressman of North Carolina, Patrick Mchenry. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio.
More fiscal response is needed. The president and I want to move forward with more fiscal response. And let me just say, the expiration of enhanced unemployment insurance is something that we are concerned about.
That, of course, was Treasury Secretary Mnuchin making his case to congressional lawmakers for their urgent need for more fiscal stimulus. And he's also reaching out to Speaker Pelosi to try to get negotiations started again. We welcome now Republican Congressman Patrick Mchenry of North Carolina, who serves as the ranking member of the House Financial Services Committee. Always good to have you, Congressman. Thank you for being here. So we heard from Secretary Mnuchin, who says it's urgent. At the same time, it seems like the parties are going further away from each other. It seemed like the Republicans were at $1 trillion, now they're at $500 billion. And we heard this was going to be cataclysmic if we didn't have something by the 1st of August. Now we're the 1st of September. We don't have anything. Do we need it?
I think so. I agree with the Fed assessment. And especially, you hear from Richmond Fed President Barkin today explaining that fiscal support is necessary because of the voluntary shutdown of our economy. And small businesses are still hurting. We've got a lot of employees that can't work from home that are really struggling. And I think it's necessary for us to have a deal. Sadly, though, this distant from a presidential election, 2 months from a presidential election, I think Speaker Pelosi and Senator Schumer are doing much more the bidding of Joe Biden's candidacy than the bidding of the American economy here. And so this has gotten caught up in presidential elections and control of the House and the Senate as well, sadly.
Well, do the Democrats have the upper hand in the sense that we do have the election coming up, and if things really crater between now and then, it could hurt the incumbent?
Oh, for sure. And that is to their advantage, and that's how I see it. And like you said, I'm a Republican member of Congress, so let's be honest, I've got my perspective. But to follow this process closely, Speaker Pelosi has a majority in the House. She's produced a $3.5 trillion spending bill, which is the largest spending bill in American history. And what Mitch McConnell and Secretary Mnuchin, on behalf of the administration, offered was the second largest spending bill in American history. And somehow that's not sufficient. So I have to step back and say, what's the game here? And quite frankly, we know the polls are tightening on the presidential election. The control of the Senate, control of the House is at stake. And so I think it's gotten wrapped up in that in their mind's eye. And sadly, the American people are the ones that are going to be punished as a result of this.
So that's on the fiscal front. Can monetary policy pull us through? We heard from the Fed last week. They're changing their approach. They're going to tolerate somewhat higher inflation, I think it's fair to say, as well as really emphasizing full employment. Do you agree with that approach, and is that going to be enough?
Well, I think the Fed has been the best actor on the global stage. I mean, I think the Federal Reserve and the leadership of Jay Powell is to be commended. They acted decisively, they acted early, and they stood up more programs in a period of 3 months than they stood up in the fullness of the last financial crisis. So they are to be commended for their actions. And the reassessment a decade after the financial crisis of the Fed's sort of going forward analysis and what they're forecasting for the economy and how they want to look at the economy, I think is necessary. And I think this Fed has put a new stamp on the direction of the Fed for the next decade. And I think that is a positive thing for the American worker, for the American economy, and for American exports.
And finally, Congressman, are you pretty confident that we're going to be okay with the Postal Service with all the mail-in votes, no matter what happens in terms of Congress appropriating more money?
Yes. And the reason why is because we have very fine people that work for the Postal Service on a daily, weekly, monthly, and yearly basis. They want to do their job. They want to do it effectively. They care about the communities they serve. And that's why it will work. It's one of the largest employers on the globe. I think the idea that you're going to have one person appointed and somehow they're not going to deliver the mail anymore is patently absurd. And so let's keep the partisan lens off the Postal Service and just let them do their jobs.
Okay, thank you so much. It's always a treat to have you with us. That's Republican Congressman Patrick Mchenry of the state of North Carolina. And a headline just crossed the Bloomberg that it came out of Italy. Former Italian Prime Minister Berlusconi has COVID-19, according to a spokesperson. He served as prime minister in 4 governments. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on Ivanka Trump is in Warren, Michigan today to get a tour from GM Chairman and CEO Mary Barra. To give us a preview, welcome now our Detroit Bureau Chief. He is David Welch. So, David, they're touring Warren, Michigan, not necessarily a standard stop for Ivanka Trump. What are they looking at?
They're looking at a training center that GM built there for about $2 million. It trains both skilled trades workers and some salaried engineers, so really people on the technical side of things. And this is important, really, for both sides. The Trump administration came to power in 2016, and one of their key areas of focus and one of Trump's promises was to rebuild manufacturing, and he had a specific eye on the auto industry. So when GM did a big restructuring last year, in the end, taking out about 11,000 jobs and closing, 4 U.S. plants and 1 in Canada, Trump really didn't like that. So GM's been kind of in their doghouse ever since. So this is an opportunity for Mary Barra to say, hey, look, we're training workers and we're putting money into Michigan and into the United States. And there's a chance for the Trump administration to say that they're getting something done in the auto industry.
Yeah, it's fascinating, David. There's been something, as you say, a sort of love-hate relationship between Donald Trump and Mary Barra, up and down and back and forth. At the same time, it's not clear to me that Mary Barra has changed her direction much, no matter what the president has said.
No, look, Lordstown is still closed, and so is a small transmission plant in Warren, Michigan, where Ivanka Trump is today, and another plant in Baltimore. You know, they have added technical jobs in Warren for things like battery electric vehicles and self-driving vehicles, but in terms of manufacturing, not so much. They're building a battery plant in conjunction with their battery partner for the electric vehicles in Lordstown, but those jobs will pay a lot less. So the union didn't, and it's so far a non-union plant unless they can organize it. So it's not a big victory for the union. It's not a big victory in terms of manufacturing wages necessarily, because it's basically it's supplementing lower wage Lordstown jobs or higher wage with lower wage jobs. Yeah. But as long as they're training workers, maybe the Trump administration is going to try to make a bit of hay out of this. But yeah, GM really has not hired more.
And David, finally here quickly at the end, going across the road to Ford, we have a new CEO coming in, and we had an announcement of 1,400 white-collar workers being laid off. Is that a surprise to you?
No, we've been waiting for this, for steps in this big $11 billion cost-cutting program that they've had for some time. This is 5% of the salaried workforce. It follows what GM did actually GM cut, I think it was 8,000 salary workers. So it follows what GM did last year. But you're going to see more of this, not just because of COVID, although that's certainly going to push things along, but because the industry's kind of in a slump too.
Okay, David, really appreciate your being with us. That's David Welch. He's Bloomberg's Detroit bureau chief. Coming up, Balance of Power continues on Bloomberg Radio. In our second hour, we're going to continue our coverage of what the Phase 4 stimulus package would look like. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio.